The morning sun rose slowly over the quiet fields, stretching light across the soil that had been worked by the same hands for generations. Mara bent down, her palms brushing over damp earth as she checked the rows of vegetables, her breath misting in the cool air. The smell of hay, wet soil, and dew wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. She was a simple farmer, nothing more, nothing less. People in the village often said she had the patience of the land itself, steady and reliable, but beneath her calm face, Mara carried a quiet ache, the kind of longing she never dared to put into words. She worked hard, yet sometimes she wondered if life held something beyond the fences of her farm. That thought often came and went like passing clouds, but lately, it lingered. That morning, as she carried baskets to the porch, she heard the sound of a car pulling into the narrow lane. Cars rarely came here, and when they did, it usually meant someone important. Mara brushed dust from her hands, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. The news had been going around the village for weeks. Lavinia Cross, the famous art curator, was coming. She was known across cities, written about in glossy magazines Mara had once flipped through when she went into town. Mara remembered staring at Lavinia's picture, the elegant way she held herself, the kind of woman who seemed untouchable, far removed from the muddy boots and calloused palms of a farmer's life. And yet, here she was, stepping out of a sleek black car right at the edge of Mara's land. Lavinia looked as though she belonged to another world entirely. Her long coat fell perfectly against her tall frame, her hair shining in the morning light, her every move measured and graceful. She greeted the villagers with a warm but professional smile, her eyes already scanning the fields and barns like she was searching for something unseen. Mara stood back for a moment, clutching her basket tighter, wondering why her chest felt so tight. She tried to remind herself she was just a host, nothing more. The council had asked her to guide Lavinia while she explored the village and the old estate on the hill. Mara almost laughed at the thought. What could she, a farmer who barely left her land, offer to someone who lived among marble halls and velvet curtains? But there was no running from it. When Lavinia's gaze finally met hers, Mara felt a shock of awareness, sharp and unsettling, as if the world around her had gone silent for a moment. Lavinia's eyes lingered, curious but unreadable, before she offered a polite nod. Mara swallowed hard, wishing her heartbeat wasn't so loud. The introductions were quick. A few polite words were exchanged, but Mara's tongue felt clumsy. She nearly dropped the folder of maps she'd been asked to carry. When the paper slipped, Lavinia bent down at the same time Mara did, their hands brushing for the briefest second. Mara froze, her skin burning where they touched, while Lavinia simply smiled and handed her the scattered sheets as if nothing had happened. But for Mara, that simple touch felt like lightning running through her veins. They walked together toward the estate, their steps falling into a rhythm. Lavinia asked questions about the land, the barns, the history of the place. Mara answered in her plain, honest way, surprised when Lavinia leaned in to listen closely, as though her words held weight. It unsettled her. Why would a woman like Lavinia care about her stories? When they reached one of the old barns, Lavinia paused, her eyes tracing faded lines carved into the wooden walls. Time and weather had nearly erased them, but the faint colors of paint still clung stubbornly. Mara's chest tightened as she looked at them. "My mother did those," she said softly, almost to herself. Lavinia turned toward her, and Mara felt exposed under her gaze. She explained haltingly how her mother used to spend hours painting on that barn wall, dreaming of turning the village into a place where art and soil lived together. But her mother had passed before those dreams could take shape. Mara's voice wavered, but she forced herself to finish, her hand brushing against the rough wood like she was touching her mother's hand again. Lavinia didn't interrupt. She stood quietly, her face softened, her eyes full of something Mara couldn't read but felt deeply. When Mara finally fell silent, Lavinia spoke in a low voice, "It's beautiful." She left her heart here. The words struck Mara harder than she expected. Few people in the village spoke of the paintings anymore, most saw them as fading scratches, nothing more. But here was this woman, this famous curator, seeing value in what Mara's mother had left behind. For the rest of the day, Lavinia explored, and Mara stayed by her side. At times Mara forgot herself, caught in the way Lavinia tilted her head at details, the way she bent down to touch textures as if each surface whispered secrets. By evening, Mara's body ached from walking, but her heart felt restless. She carried baskets back to her porch, waved Lavinia off as she returned to her guest house, and then sat under the stars, unable to breathe right. She kept seeing Lavinia's eyes, hearing her voice, feeling the light brush of her hand. It was ridiculous, Mara told herself. A farmer and a curator? They lived in different worlds. And yet, the thought of her lingered like the scent of wildflowers after rain. When Mara finally lay down that night, she stared at the ceiling, unable to shut her eyes. The quiet of the farmhouse pressed around her, but her mind was loud, spinning with one impossible question she couldn't silence. Was this admiration, or was it something more dangerous, something she had never dared to dream for herself? The days that followed began to feel different, though Mara could not quite explain why. Every morning still started with the same rhythm, the rooster's call, the smell of damp earth, the steady pull of weeds between rows of vegetables, but now there was a new presence that pulled her thoughts away from the soil. Lavinia was still in the village, still wandering the barns and old walls with her notebook and camera, and each time Mara was asked to accompany her, the hours seemed to slip by like minutes. What surprised Mara most was how easily conversation began to flow. At first, she had been stiff, giving short, clipped answers to Lavinia's curious questions. But Lavinia never mocked, never dismissed, she simply listened, tilting her head and holding her eyes steady, as if Mara's words carried a weight no one else had bothered to notice before. Slowly, Mara began to share more. She told Lavinia about her mother's brushes, still kept in a wooden box in the shed, their bristles worn and hardened with time. She admitted that some evenings, when loneliness pressed too hard, she would take them out and hold them, not to paint but just to feel a piece of her mother in her hands again. Lavinia asked if she could see them, and when Mara hesitated, ashamed that they were cracked and stained, Lavinia's voice softened. "Show me," she said, not as a demand but as a plea. That afternoon, Mara led her to the shed. Dust drifted in the air, and the old wood creaked as they entered. She lifted the box from the shelf, brushing away the cobwebs, and opened it in front of her guest. Lavinia reached out carefully, like the brushes were fragile relics rather than forgotten tools. She took one in her hand, running her fingers gently across its stiff bristles, her eyes shining in a way Mara had not expected. "These are not ruined," she whispered, more to herself than to Mara. "They've lived." Mara felt her throat tighten. No one had ever spoken of them with reverence. To everyone else, they were trash, but Lavinia looked at them as if they were priceless. Mara turned away, blinking fast, embarrassed by the sudden rush of tears she could not control. Lavinia did not comment, but when Mara's voice wavered as she tried to explain how her mother had dreamed of art beyond the farm, Lavinia placed the brush back gently, and for a long moment, she said nothing, just stood in the silence as though she understood that sometimes words were too heavy to carry. Later, as they walked the fields, Mara asked her why she had chosen to be a curator, why she spent her life surrounded by galleries and glass cases instead of creating art herself. Lavinia gave a small laugh, the kind that sounded tired even when it tried to be light. She told Mara how she had once wanted to paint but had been told by teachers and mentors that she lacked the spark, that her real gift was seeing potential in others. She said she accepted that role, climbing the ladder of galleries and museums, becoming known for her eye, for her ability to bring art alive to the public. But in her voice, Mara caught a hollow note. When Lavinia said, "Sometimes I wonder if I've lost sight of why I started," Mara did not know how to answer. All she could do was glance at her, noticing the way her strong shoulders sagged slightly, the way her gaze wandered far across the fields, like she was searching for something she had misplaced years ago. As the sun dropped low that evening, Lavinia surprised Mara by asking if they could stay out longer. She wanted to see how the light changed across the fields, she said, how shadows stretched and faded. They ended up perched on the old fence, the wood cool under their legs, while the sky burned orange and purple above them. For the first time, Mara let herself forget who Lavinia was in the world outside this village. She laughed when Lavinia wrinkled her nose at the smell of the cows, teased her when she struggled to balance on the uneven fence rail. Lavinia laughed too, her voice warmer than Mara had ever heard, and in that moment, the distance between their lives seemed smaller. The stars began to prick the sky, one by one, and the air turned crisp. Mara hugged her arms around herself, shivering slightly, but she stayed. It was then that Lavinia turned her head, her voice softer than the night breeze. "Stay with me tonight." The words slipped out so quietly that Mara almost thought she imagined them, but when she looked at Lavinia, she saw the truth of them in her eyes. Not command, not casual invitation, but something deeper. Mara's breath caught. She did not know what to say, did not know what Lavinia truly meant, whether it was simply to sit here under the stars, or whether it was a plea for something larger, a closeness both of them had been skirting around all these days. Her heart thundered in her chest. She gave the smallest nod, unable to trust her voice, and they sat together until the field sank into silence, the night wrapping them in a cocoon that felt like it belonged only to them. For Mara, the simple words echoed long after, filling her with a mixture of warmth and fear. It was dangerous, she told herself, to hope for more. And yet, as she lay in her bed that night, listening to the quiet hum of the countryside, all she could hear was that whisper playing over and over in her mind. Mara woke the next morning with her heart still racing from the night before, the memory of Lavinia's whisper clinging to her like the scent of smoke on her clothes. She moved through her chores with clumsy hands, spilling grain, tripping over a bucket, her mind unable to settle. Every time she paused, she saw Lavinia's face in the dim starlight, heard that hushed voice asking her to stay, and she wondered if she had imagined the depth in it, the yearning. She told herself not to read too much into it, not to hope for something impossible, but the thought was stubborn. By the time she finished feeding the animals, her chest ached with questions she could not answer. When she walked to the estate later that day, Lavinia was already there, bent over a notebook as she sketched outlines of the old stone walls. She looked different in the daylight, less ethereal, more grounded, her hair pulled back loosely, her boots dirted by the soil. Still, she carried an air of grace Mara could never mimic. Mara approached cautiously, half expecting Lavinia to retreat behind that professional mask again, but instead Lavinia looked up, her face softening into a smile that made Mara's stomach twist. "You came," she said, as though she had been waiting, and Mara felt something inside her crack open. They spent the day together again, but now the air between them seemed heavier, charged with something unspoken. When their hands brushed as they carried an old frame into the barn, neither pulled away. When Mara offered Lavinia a jar of milk she had brought from the farm, their fingers lingered longer than needed on the glass. It was dangerous, Mara thought, the way these small touches made her chest flutter, but she could not help herself. At noon, they sat on the grass to eat. Mara had brought bread and cheese, and Lavinia surprised her by laughing at how simple the meal was, then admitting it was the most satisfying thing she had tasted in weeks. Mara watched her close her eyes after the first bite, the way her lips curved as though tasting sunlight itself, and something fierce rose in her chest, a desire to keep giving her such moments of peace. As they ate, Lavinia asked questions not about the barns or the estate but about Mara herself. What had her childhood been like? Did she ever want to leave the farm? Did she ever dream of living elsewhere? Mara hesitated before answering. No one had asked her such things before, and the truth frightened her. She admitted she sometimes dreamed of more, of seeing cities and oceans and the kind of art her mother had only read about, but she always feared that if she left, she would lose herself. "The soil holds me," she said quietly, looking down at her calloused hands. "If I leave it, I don't know who I'd be." Lavinia didn't laugh, didn't dismiss her. Instead, she nodded slowly, her eyes unreadable but full of something that made Mara's chest ache. "Maybe the soil doesn't just hold you," Lavinia murmured, almost like she was speaking to herself. "Maybe it gives you strength to go further." The words echoed in Mara's mind long after they finished eating. That night, after a long day of walking and cataloging, Lavinia asked Mara to stay with her again, this time in the small guest house where she was staying. Mara's breath caught, her cheeks flushing, but Lavinia explained softly that she only meant she wanted company, someone to talk to as the night stretched long. Mara agreed, though her nerves rattled. They sat by the fire together, Lavinia telling stories of her travels, grand museums in Paris, private collections hidden in old castles, secret auctions where paintings worth millions were passed hand to hand. Mara listened wide-eyed, but beneath the awe was sadness. Lavinia's stories always ended the same way, with loneliness, with her being the last one standing in a cold hotel room or an empty gallery once the lights dimmed. Mara told her own stories too, simple tales of planting seasons, harvest festivals, her mother's stubborn laughter even in the face of droughts. Lavinia listened as though every detail mattered. At one point, Mara noticed Lavinia's head drooping, her lashes lowering as exhaustion tugged at her. Without thinking, Mara reached out and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. Lavinia's eyes fluttered open, and for a breathless moment, they simply looked at each other. The fire crackled softly, shadows dancing across their faces, and Mara felt the pull of something she had no words for. Lavinia reached out, her fingers brushing Mara's wrist, not gripping, just touching, and whispered, "I don't want to be alone tonight." Mara's heart pounded so hard she thought it might shake the walls. She nodded, unable to speak, and sat closer until their shoulders touched. They didn't move beyond that, didn't cross the fragile line between them, but for Mara it felt as if they had already stepped into new territory, dangerous and tender all at once. She sat awake long after Lavinia drifted to sleep beside her, listening to her breathing, steady and soft, memorizing it as though it were the most precious sound in the world. Mara knew she was falling into something she might not be able to climb out of, but for once, she didn't want to. She wanted to stay in that firelit room, in that fragile warmth, even if it was only borrowed. And as the night deepened, she realized with a jolt of fear and hope that Lavinia's whispered request was not just for company, it was a confession of a loneliness only Mara could ease. The weeks slipped by like sand between Mara's fingers, and when Lavinia left suddenly for the city, the silence she left behind weighed heavier than Mara expected. The village felt smaller without her presence, the barns too quiet, the nights too long. Mara returned to her routines, but everything felt altered. The animals still needed feeding, the field still needed tending, yet nothing filled the emptiness. She would catch herself glancing toward the guesthouse at dusk, waiting for a glimpse of Lavinia's coat, only to be reminded that she was gone. The absence stung in a way Mara could not name, and she began to fear that the brief closeness they had shared would dissolve once Lavinia returned to her real world. But then, weeks later, the sleek car reappeared on the lane, carrying with it the woman who had unsettled her entire life. Lavinia stepped out, her face familiar yet somehow distant, her smile quick but faint. She carried more bags this time, her phone buzzing endlessly, her steps hurried. Mara noticed the way she pressed her lips together as though holding in 100 thoughts. When their eyes met, Mara felt the same spark as before, but this time there was a shadow behind it, a tiredness Lavinia couldn't hide. She spoke of the city, of meetings and deadlines, of the upcoming exhibition that loomed like a storm on the horizon. She explained how donors expected perfection, how critics circled like hawks, and how every choice she made was weighed against her reputation. Mara listened silently, realizing with a sinking heart how far Lavinia's world was from the soil beneath her feet. Yet Lavinia stayed. She returned to the barns, the estate, and to Mara's side, though now her time was split between long phone calls and rushed conversations. Mara felt a pang of jealousy toward the unseen world that demanded so much of Lavinia's attention. She tried to swallow it down, reminding herself that she was only a farmer. Still, the ache grew. One evening, while the restoration team worked, Mara suggested that the exhibition should include the barn wall her mother had painted. She explained how it carried the history of the village, how it told a story of roots and resilience. For Mara, it was more than art, it was her mother's voice preserved in faded lines. Lavinia hesitated. She looked at Mara with gentle eyes but said nothing, letting the committee speak first. They dismissed the idea quickly, labeling it too raw, too rustic, not refined enough for the kind of audience they aimed to attract. Their words cut deep, but what wounded Mara most was Lavinia's silence. She had expected her to fight, to defend the value she had once seen in those fading colors, but instead Lavinia remained quiet, caught between the weight of her profession and the truth of Mara's heart. Mara forced a smile, but inside she felt something collapse. That night, back at the farmhouse, the unspoken tension finally spilled over. Mara confronted Lavinia, her voice trembling but firm. She accused her of being ashamed of the very soil that had shaped her, of being unwilling to risk her reputation for something real. Her words came out sharper than she intended, but they were laced with pain. Lavinia listened, her face pale, her hands twisting together. She tried to explain that the art world was cruel, that one wrong choice could ruin everything she had built. She said she wanted to protect both Mara and herself, that she was trying to balance two worlds that were never meant to meet. But Mara heard only hesitation, only fear, and it made her feel small again, like the farmer who could never measure up to the curator's shining world. The silence after their argument was heavy. They shared the same roof that night but not the same space. Mara lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her chest aching as though something had splintered inside. Across the hall, Lavinia sat by the window of the guest room, her face illuminated by moonlight. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, fighting the sting in her eyes. She wanted to go to Mara, to hold her, to promise she would fight for her. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled with fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of losing everything she had worked for. The night dragged on, long and restless. Mara wept quietly, her body curled against the emptiness beside her. Lavinia stayed awake, the stars outside blurring as her thoughts spiraled. Both women, alone in their corners, longed for the other, yet neither knew how to bridge the widening gap. When the first light of dawn crept over the fields, it revealed not peace but two hearts weighed down by love and doubt, each wondering if the distance between soil and city was simply too great to cross. The morning after their argument felt heavier than the damp fog that hung low over the fields. Mara moved through her chores in silence, her body stiff with exhaustion from a night of restless turning. Every movement was mechanical, as though her mind had been stripped from her body. She tried to focus on the rhythm of work, the clink of metal buckets, the rustle of hay, but every sound reminded her of the words she had hurled at Lavinia, and the silence that had followed. Her chest tightened each time she replayed it, because beneath her anger had been something else, fear. Fear that Lavinia's world would swallow her, fear that she had already been left behind. When she returned to the farmhouse, Lavinia was there, waiting at the table with 2 cups of tea, her shoulders slightly hunched, her eyes shadowed with the weight of sleepless hours. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching between them like a rope pulled too tight. Then Lavinia pushed 1 cup toward Mara, her fingers trembling as they brushed the rim. "I don't want to lose what we've found here," she said softly, her voice hoarse as though every word cost her. Mara lowered herself onto the chair, staring into the steam rising from the cup. She didn't answer at once. She didn't trust her voice not to break. When she finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper. "Then why didn't you fight for me?" The question cracked something open, and tears welled in Lavinia's eyes before she could stop them. She reached across the table, laying her hand over Mara's. For a moment Mara considered pulling away, but the warmth of Lavinia's skin, the desperation in her grip, kept her still. Lavinia explained that the art world was brutal, that every choice was scrutinized, every misstep magnified. She admitted she had been afraid of losing credibility, afraid of failing her donors, afraid of disappointing people who expected perfection. But in the process, she whispered, "I failed you. And I failed myself." Mara swallowed hard, torn between relief and hurt. She wanted to believe her, but doubt still lingered. She asked, her voice trembling, "Do you really see value in what's here, or was that just kindness?" Lavinia's gaze sharpened, and she leaned forward with urgency. "I see beauty here. I see truth. When I look at that barn wall, I see more than fading paint. I see a story that belongs to you, to your mother, to this place. And I want the world to see it too. Mara blinked, surprised by the fervor in her tone. Something in her chest loosened, though the wound of disappointment hadn't fully healed. Lavinia seemed to sense this, and so she made a choice. That afternoon she took Mara into the city's restoration workshop, a place buzzing with quiet industry. The space smelled of varnish and paper, and everywhere there were frames, sculptures, and canvases in varying states of repair. Mara felt out of place among the precision tools and delicate gloves, her boots too loud on the polished floor. But Lavinia guided her gently, introducing her to the assistants, explaining how each step was part of preserving stories that would otherwise be forgotten. Mara stood in awe, realizing for the first time how much work went into giving history a voice. Lavinia then placed a folder in Mara's hands. Inside were sketches, notes, and plans for the upcoming exhibition. She pointed to a section where photographs of the barn wall had been carefully pasted, alongside Mara's mother's brushes, cleaned and preserved. I fought for this, Lavinia said, her voice steady despite the flicker of fear in her eyes. It's not final yet, but I want you to help me make it undeniable. Mara stared at the folder, her throat tightening. No one had ever asked her to be part of something beyond the farm. She felt both terrified and honored. Slowly, she nodded, her lips curving into the first real smile she had managed in days. Over the next weeks, they worked side by side. Late nights found them hunched over drafts and samples, their heads close together, their laughter breaking through the exhaustion. Mara offered insights about the textures of wood, the stories of the land, while Lavinia guided her through the technicalities of presentation and curation. They grew into a rhythm, like two hands weaving the same thread. One night, as they brushed a piece of wood meant to frame the barn wall photograph, their fingers touched again, lingering longer than either of them intended. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with everything they had not yet dared to say. Lavinia looked at her then, her eyes shining not with exhaustion but with something deeper. I need you here, Mara, she whispered, the words trembling in the space between them. Mara's heart thudded painfully in her chest, her breath catching. She wanted to answer, to confess that she felt the same, that every day spent by Lavinia's side made her feel seen in a way she never had before. But fear held her tongue, and all she could do was meet her gaze and let her silence carry the truth. That night, Mara lay awake again, the brush still warm from Lavinia's hand resting on the table nearby. She realized that no matter how impossible it seemed, she was no longer standing on the edges of Lavinia's world. She was inside it now, a part of something bigger than herself. And though the future was uncertain, the thought no longer filled her with dread, it filled her with a fragile, dangerous hope. The weeks moved quickly once preparations for the exhibition began, and Mara found herself caught in a whirlwind she had never imagined she would be part of. The abandoned estate that had once stood forgotten on the edge of the village was transformed into a hive of activity. Workers hammered, painted, polished, and hung frames while the villagers stood outside in small clusters, curious but hesitant to step inside. For Mara, the sight was overwhelming. She had always known these barns and walls as simple shelters for animals and tools, but now she watched them become something more, spaces that held the stories of her mother, her village, and the land itself. And at the center of it all was Lavinia, orchestrating with calm precision, her sharp eyes catching details that no one else would notice. Yet even as she carried herself with authority, Mara saw how the pressure pressed against her. Lavinia would step outside after meetings, her shoulders taut, her jaw clenched, her phone buzzing with endless calls from city donors and critics. When she returned, her face would be composed, but Mara noticed the weariness she tried to hide. One evening, after the workers had gone, Mara walked through the half-finished exhibition hall. Her steps echoed in the space where spotlights already illuminated canvases and sculptures borrowed from collections. But her attention was drawn to a small display tucked in the corner, her mother's brushes, carefully arranged under glass, beside a photograph of the barn wall painting. Mara's throat tightened, and she reached out instinctively, her fingers pressing against the cold surface of the case. She had never thought anyone beyond her village would care about those brushes, yet here they were, treated with reverence. Lavinia appeared beside her, quiet at first, then speaking softly. I wanted to surprise you. I wanted her story to have a place here. Mara turned toward her, tears pricking her eyes, unable to find words. Instead, she stepped closer, letting their shoulders touch. For a brief moment, the stress of the exhibition and the fear of judgment faded. But the peace did not last. Word began to spread that the exhibition would feature rural and folk-inspired art alongside the refined pieces from established collections. Some praised the decision, saying it would bring freshness and authenticity. Others sneered, whispering that Lavinia was risking her reputation by lowering the standard of her work. Mara overheard fragments of these conversations when visitors came early to preview. Phrases like too provincial, charming but not serious, and a dangerous gamble drifted through the halls. Each word struck her like a stone. She began to doubt whether her mother's brushes belonged here, whether her heritage was worthy of such a stage. That night she sat alone on the farmhouse steps, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the fields without seeing them. When Lavinia found her, Mara could not hide her hurt. They don't see it, Mara said, her voice breaking. To them, it's just scraps of wood and paint from a barn. Maybe they're right. Maybe it doesn't belong here. Lavinia knelt in front of her, her hands firm on Mara's knees, forcing her to meet her gaze. They are wrong, she said fiercely. Your mother's work is not scraps. It is memory. It is truth. It carries more weight than all the polished canvases in the world because it came from her heart. And I will fight anyone who dares to say otherwise. Mara wanted to believe her, but fear still clawed at her chest. What if they ruin you for this, she whispered. What if standing by me destroys everything you've built? Lavinia's face softened, though her eyes still burned with conviction. Then let it. Because if I build a life that turns its back on what matters, what is it worth? The intensity of her words shook Mara, and for the first time she realized just how much Lavinia was willing to risk. In the days that followed, Lavinia stood firm against critics and donors who questioned her decisions. She defended the inclusion of the barn wall and the brushes with passion that silenced many, though some still muttered disapproval. Mara watched her with awe, torn between pride and fear. She saw how exhausting it was for Lavinia to stand against such resistance, how much weight pressed on her shoulders. And yet, she never wavered. When opening night drew closer, the estate hummed with anticipation. Invitations had gone out to galleries, patrons, and critics from across the region. The village buzzed with nervous excitement, some skeptical, others proud. Mara moved through the preparations in a haze, caught between disbelief and anxiety. She had lived her whole life in this village, unseen by the world beyond, and now she was about to stand in a hall filled with strangers who would judge not just Lavinia but her too. On the eve of the opening, Mara nearly faltered. She told Lavinia she wasn't sure she could face it, that she felt like an imposter among people who spoke in polished words and carried themselves like they owned the world. Lavinia took her hand gently, her thumb brushing across her skin, and whispered, "You are not an imposter, Mara. You are the heart of this exhibition. Without you, it would be empty. With you, it is alive." Mara felt tears sting her eyes at the certainty in her voice. That night they sat together in the empty exhibition hall, the displays glowing softly under the lights, the silence filled with both fear and hope. Mara leaned her head against Lavinia's shoulder, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe she belonged here, not as an outsider but as someone whose roots had something worth sharing. As the night deepened and the first stars appeared through the estate windows, she felt Lavinia's hand slip into hers, warm and steady, a silent promise that no matter what awaited them when the doors opened, they would face it together. The day of the exhibition arrived with a kind of weight Mara had never known before. The estate, once quiet and forgotten, now pulsed with life. Cars lined the lane, their polished surfaces gleaming under the fading light of evening. The villagers stood at the edges of the crowd, their faces half-proud, half-curious, while strangers from the city spilled onto the gravel, their voices sharp, their laughter practiced, their clothing too fine for the soil they stepped upon. Mara stood at the doorway of the hall, her hands damp, her heart pounding so loudly she feared others might hear it. She wore a simple dress Lavinia had insisted on, nothing extravagant, but to Mara it felt like armor she wasn't sure fit her. She wanted to run back to the fields, to hide among the rows of corn and let the night pass without her. But then Lavinia appeared beside her, radiant yet calm, her hand brushing against Mara's lightly, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. Together they stepped into the hall. Inside, the air hummed with expectation. Spotlights washed the walls in warm light, illuminating canvases, sculptures, and carefully curated pieces. But it was the corner that drew the most attention, the display of brushes, photographs, and fragments from the barn wall. At first the crowd gathered there hesitantly, as though unsure whether something so raw deserved their gaze. Mara stood back, her chest tight, watching as critics leaned closer, their brows furrowed, their notebooks ready. She braced herself for dismissal, for laughter, for cruel whispers. Instead, there was silence, long and unbroken, as they studied the pieces. Some tilted their heads, some stepped back, some leaned in again as though trying to catch what had been left behind in the strokes of fading paint. Then the murmur began, not of mockery but of curiosity. Words drifted through the crowd, unexpected, authentic, honest. A well-dressed woman with silver hair touched the glass over the brushes and whispered to the man beside her, "This feels alive." Mara's breath caught, her vision blurring with sudden tears. She turned to look at Lavinia, who stood tall, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and triumph. For all the weeks of fear, for all the whispered doubts, the moment had arrived, and it was not scorn that greeted them but wonder. Yet not everyone was convinced. A group of stern-faced patrons stood in the back, their voices low but sharp. Mara could catch only fragments, risky, too common, what will the board think, but each word stung like a lash. She wanted to shrink under the weight of it, to apologize for daring to stand in their world. But then Lavinia stepped forward, her voice calm but strong, addressing the crowd as though the doubters didn't exist. She spoke not with the polished tone of a curator but with the quiet conviction of someone who believed in what she was saying. She told them of the wall, of the farmers' hands that painted it, of the community it sheltered, of the way art was not always born in studios but sometimes in barns, carried in weathered wood and calloused palms. She spoke of history that could not be replicated, of voices often overlooked. She spoke of Mara's mother. And as she spoke, the hall grew still, the murmurs fading into silence. Every word seemed to pull the weight from Mara's chest, as though Lavinia had gathered her pain and turned it into strength. Mara watched her, her throat aching with emotion, realizing just how much Lavinia had risked to stand beside her in this moment. When Lavinia finished, there was a long pause. Then the applause began, hesitant at first, then stronger, filling the hall until it echoed against the rafters. Mara felt her knees weaken, her hand instinctively reaching for Lavinia's. Their fingers intertwined, and for a moment it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them, bound together in the glow of triumph and relief. As the evening wore on, guests moved through the displays, speaking not only of the grand works but of the barn wall and the brushes. Some villagers wept quietly, touched to see their heritage honored in such a space. Mara found herself approached by strangers, their voices warm, their eyes kind, asking her about the land, about her mother, about the stories woven into the paint. Each time she answered, her voice grew steadier, her pride stronger. And through it all, Lavinia stayed close, her presence steady, her gaze often lingering on Mara with a tenderness that made her chest tighten. When the night finally drew to a close and the last guests departed, the hall was left in silence once more. Mara and Lavinia stood in the center, surrounded by the glow of lights and the scent of polished wood. Mara turned to her, tears slipping down her cheeks unchecked. "You did this," she whispered. Lavinia shook her head gently, her hand rising to brush the tears from Mara's face. "We did this," she corrected softly. And in that quiet, with the weight of the night pressing in and the echoes of applause still lingering in the air, Mara leaned forward, closing the space between them, her lips brushing against Lavinia's in a kiss that was at once hesitant and inevitable. It was not grand, not rehearsed, not polished, it was raw, trembling, filled with everything they had held back. And when they pulled apart, breathless and shaking, they both knew the truth that words could no longer hide. They belonged not only to their worlds but to each other. The morning after the exhibition dawned quiet, the estate wrapped in a fragile stillness that felt almost sacred. Sunlight spilled through the high windows, falling across the remnants of the night before, the empty glasses on side tables, the faint scent of perfume and polish still lingering in the air, the quiet hum of success echoing even in the silence. Mara woke early, her body restless though her heart carried a kind of peace she had never known. She walked through the empty hall alone, her fingers brushing against the smooth wood of the frames, her gaze lingering on the corner where her mother's brushes were displayed. The glass reflected the morning light, and for a moment it looked as though the colors had come alive again, glowing with a warmth that reached deep into her chest. She whispered a thank you, not knowing if it was to her mother, to Lavinia, or to the world itself for allowing this moment to exist. Behind her, footsteps sounded softly. Lavinia entered, her hair loose, her expression unguarded in a way Mara had seen only in quiet moments. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside Mara, their shoulders brushing lightly. Together they looked at the display, the silence between them thick with everything that had happened. Finally, Lavinia spoke, her voice low but steady. "I was afraid last night. Afraid they would laugh, afraid I would lose everything I've worked for. But then I saw you, standing there, and I realized none of it matters if I can't stand beside you." Mara turned toward her, her eyes searching. "And if it does cost you everything?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. Lavinia met her gaze, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "Then I'll build something new. With you." The simplicity of the words stole Mara's breath. She had spent her life believing she was too small for someone like Lavinia, too rooted in soil and sweat to stand in the glitter of her world. Yet here she was, not only seen but chosen. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them, and Lavinia reached out, brushing them away with a tenderness that made Mara's heart ache. In the days that followed, their lives began to shift in quiet, unexpected ways. The exhibition drew praise from critics who had once doubted, calling it bold, necessary, even revolutionary. Invitations flooded in for Lavinia to curate future projects, and while some questioned her choices, many celebrated her vision. But for Mara, the true victory lay not in the headlines but in the villagers who came to see their own history honored. Old men who had once dismissed art as frivolous stood with tears in their eyes before the brushes. Children pointed at the photographs, wide-eyed, asking questions about the people who had lived and loved in those barns. For the first time, Mara felt her world and Lavinia's intertwine in a way that did not diminish either but instead made them both richer. Yet life was not suddenly perfect. There were still whispers, still doubts, still long nights where Lavinia wrestled with the weight of expectation and Mara wrestled with the fear of not belonging. But each time the doubts rose, they found each other again, in the farmhouse kitchen, over cups of tea, in the quiet moments when the rest of the world fell away. One evening, as autumn crept into the air and the fields turned gold, Lavinia stood on the farmhouse porch, looking out at the horizon. Mara joined her, leaning against the worn wooden rail, her hands rough from work, her dress smelling faintly of hay. Lavinia slipped her arm around her, pulling her close, and whispered the words that had once started it all, "Stay with me tonight." This time Mara didn't hesitate. She leaned into her, her heart full, and answered with a certainty she had never felt before. "I will. Always." The stars rose above them, scattering the night with light, and for the first time neither of them felt torn between soil and city, between past and future. They had built a bridge between worlds that others thought could never meet, and though the road ahead was uncertain, they knew they would walk it together. In that embrace, with the cool air brushing their skin and the vast sky stretching overhead, Mara understood that love was not about choosing one world over another. It was about creating a place where both could exist, where roots and wings could grow side by side. And in that place, she and Lavinia had found something neither of them had dared to dream of, a home not just in a farmhouse or a gallery, but in each other.